My name is Shawn Dooley. I'm the state representative for the 9th Norfolk District, this area, Plainville, Wrentham, Norfolk, Millis, Medfield, and Walpole. And I would like to also let everyone know that my fellow representative, Jeffrey Roy, who represents Franklin and Medway,
What are you doing?
is also in attendance. So a few other reps have been invited, so hopefully we'll get some of them in as well. The format for tonight is going to be very, very simple. I'm going to start off with 5 questions. Each person's going to get about 5 minutes to describe, to answer the question, so we can keep it moving. Then at the end, those of you who've been passing out 3x5 cards or 4x6 cards, whatever, we'll be collecting those, and what I'll do is, depending on how time it allows, we'll go through those all at the end, and at least try and get 3 or 4 or 5 of them answered as well, and get them pushed through as fast as possible. We also have Pat Francamato from the King Philip School Committee, and I'm not sure if there's any other school committee members. The Norfolk School Committee sends their regrets. They had to actually move their meeting from last week to tonight at the last minute. So without further ado, we'll get started. Starting at my far left is Bob Bickerton. He serves as the management consultant and is the lead for the possible transition to the PARCC, Next Generation Assessments for Massachusetts. Next to him is Dr. Elizabeth Gonsalves, who is the department head of English for Abington Public Schools, and she is a PARCC fellow, which means she is a professional development provider for PARCC. Next to her is Mr. Jamie Glass, Pioneer Institute's director of Center for School Reform. At Pioneer is trained, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers and numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. And then next to him is Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who is credited with developing one of the country's strongest sets of academic standards for K-12 while serving as the Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education from 1999 to 2003. She served as a National Validation Committee for the Common Core State Systematic Initiative in 2009-2010. And I'll start with Bob, and you can just say a little quick 1 minute about, you can add to my introduction and say how you fall into the Common Core PARCC debate, as it were.
Yes, Representative, and thank you for hosting the meeting and for moderating it tonight. I think this is very important for parents and students alike, for each of our communities, so I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion. I began my teaching career 42 years ago, and that was while a work-study student at MIT, teaching math to adults who did not succeed in school, and there's quite a few of them still in our state today. For the last 26 years, I've been Senior Associate Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and I've overseen many of the offices that work directly with schools, with teachers, with administrators, and over the last several years have been working on the transition from our prior standards to the Common Core standards and the potential transition to PARCC, the new assessment system. I want to emphasize potential because we set a very high bar. PARCC is going to have to be better than MCAS, which quite frankly is the best of the assessments delivered nationally. So again, I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Good evening, and thank you, Representative. My name is Dr. Liz Gonsalves, and I'm a department chair of English at Abington High School, and I'm here for my students, their parents, and my community and my colleagues. I've been teaching since 1983, and I've been in Abington for 18 years. I was there when MCAS happened, and it caused a great deal of anxiety because we had never had an external assessment like that before. So when I heard that there may be a transition to a new assessment, I considered it my professional responsibility to my students, their families, and our community to learn as much about it as I could. So I learned of the opportunity to volunteer, to be a PARCC fellow, to find out what it was about up close and personal. And I am here in my role tonight to share the information I have with you, just the way I share it with my teachers, my students, my colleagues who are administrators. And I work through Bridgewater State University's Readiness Center, helping people in teacher preparation programs and other educational leaders in the community to understand what it is that's going on and to represent them and their questions when I go to attend professional development workshops. So I'm glad to be here to spread and share the knowledge that I have. Thank you.
Great. Welcome. First of all, I want to thank the representative. Is this on? Yep. I want to thank the representative, and I want to thank the other panelists, because the reality is, though, even though the Commonwealth adopted Common Core a little over 3.5 years or so ago, I think this is the first occasion in which we've had folks from the department that have actually been willing to share a public forum on the event. So, again, my name is Jamie Gass. I'm Director of the Center for School Reform at Pioneer Institute. Even though I look like I've just graduated from high school, I've been working around K-12 education policy issues for about 20 years or so. I come from a family of educators. That is, say, both my grandmother and my mother were both teachers and principals for 35 and 40 years apiece. And Pioneer Institute is an independent, nonpartisan research organization that has been around K-12 education in Massachusetts for about 20 years or so. We're probably best known for the work that we've done around charter schools, but I think everyone agrees that we've been one of the prime movers in terms of doing independent, peer-reviewed research on K-12 education. And I think even our folks on the other side of the panel would agree that we've had probably the biggest impact in terms of the research being done on the academic quality, legality, and cost of Common Core. So I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and I look forward to the discussion.
I too thank you for the invitation to be on a panel here and the opportunity to find out where Norfolk is. I never got here, even though I grew up in Bridgewater, and I taught in the Eastondale Public Schools when I first began teaching many years ago in the town of Easton, but never got quite far enough west to find out where the little town of Norfolk at that time was. I bring to the discussion my experience in the department. As you mentioned, I was Senior Associate Commissioner from 99 to 2003, in charge of the development or revision of all of our K-12 standards in all of our major subjects, teacher licensing regulations, teacher licensure tests, and professional development criteria. I later became a member of the State Board of Education for 4 years, and while I was on the State Board, I was also appointed to Common Core's Validation Committee. So I have been very much involved with the development and revision of standards, especially English language arts and reading standards, for many, many years, and my own professional training has been in the field of reading and reading research, literary study. I was the editor of a research journal in the teaching of English, so I bring all of that background to my observations and comments for the past 4 years. Thank you.
So we'll start off with the first one. If you want to start with Dr. Stosky, if you want to start. What is the Common Core standard and framework in layman's terms, and what does it mean to our children, and what changes to the curriculum is it bringing about?
Common Core is first of all a set of standards for both English language arts and mathematics. There are a set of science standards that have recently come down the pike. They have been developed by Achieve Incorporated and a national science teachers organization, and they have been made compatible with Common Core standards, but they are strictly not Common Core. The 3 sets of standards are now probably under discussion in many different states and communities. And what they mean will depend very much on what local communities do with the base that they have been given from Common Core. Local communities do have a lot of authority vested in them because they have locally elected school committees, school boards in other parts of the country. And local control is still very much a meaningful issue in this country, not so in most other countries in the world. But in this country, local control means that some decisions can be made at the local level. whether people realize it or not, and this is part of the problem that I hope we'll be exploring and talking about a little bit tonight, there are many local communities that do not think that they have the right to have their own standards if they differ from Common Core's because they want more rigorous standards or they want other standards, and they also have the right to have their own curriculum reflecting these other standards that they choose to develop or adopt. So this is something we'll need to talk more about. The meaning of Common Core in general for the country is that at the high school level, both sets of standards are much weaker than what we anticipated, and certainly much weaker here in the state of Massachusetts as far as I'm concerned, and I'll go into detail later on, than what we thought we should have, which was why I was one of the 5 people who would not sign off when I was on the Common Core Validation Committee to approve of Common Core standards, because I didn't think they were 1, internationally benchmarked, 2, research-based, or rigorous. I'll stop there.
Okay. James?
So what Common Core is, it's a set of English and math standards that were developed by 2 Washington, D.C. based trade organizations, the National Governors Association, which represents the governors from each state, and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represents the state commissioners from each state, and Achieve Inc. and a variety of other Washington, D.C. based organizations around education who have long felt that we need to have national standards and testing and curriculum in this country. The bulk of the funding for the development of Common Core came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You can go right on their website. A lot of the organizations you're going to hear about tonight have been generously funded to the tune of well over $250 million from the Gates Foundation. So that is who is paying for it. These are private organizations that are not accountable to the public and do not hold the public trust and are not subject to sunshine laws or Freedom of Information Act searches. So the way in which Pioneer became connected with it is that given that Massachusetts is the highest performing state in the union on the NAEP test, which is National Assessment of Educational Progress, every 2 years from 2005 to 2013, and internationally competitive on TIMSS testing, PISA testing, and frankly every other test known to humanity, we felt as though Massachusetts should take a very hard look at what it is that Common Core is. And what we did is we enlisted the expertise of Sandra Stotsky, who worked on the standards here in Massachusetts and a handful of other states, and even the Common Core advocates recognize her as the best respected academic expert on ELA standards in the country. And we coupled her together with Jim Milgram, who worked on the very high quality math standards in California, and Zev Werman, who is a Silicon Valley engineer who also worked on the California math standards. And what our experts in 4 peer-reviewed and independent pieces of research illustrated is that Common Core was of significantly lower quality than what high standard states like Massachusetts, Indiana, Minnesota, Texas, and others had. Specifically, they ignored the evidence from the Massachusetts success and cut classic literature, poetry, and drama, which had been really the kind of the wellspring of our success in reading, by about 60%. On the mathematics side, the progression to Algebra 1 under Common Core was weaker, a grade or 2 lower than what Massachusetts and California and other high standard states had, and weaker than what the highest performing East Asian countries had. That is on the academic quality side. We have also done additional research on the legality, because everyone around this conversation has known for decades that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibit the federal government from funding, validating, directing national standards, testing, and curriculum. Massachusetts adopted Common Core through a federal grant program called Race to the Top, and is participating as a governing state in a PARCC test, which was directly funded by the U.S. Department of Education. The research that we did on this was conducted by the 2 highest ranking lawyers in the federal government under the second Bush administration, and their opinion is that both the development of Common Core and adoption through the federal government, as well as the PARCC testing, is a violation of the 3 federal laws. Those are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, the General Education Provision Act of 1970, and the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself in 1979. We also did one final piece of research on the cost because, including Massachusetts, most of the states that have adopted Common Core have never produced any cost projection on what it will cost states and localities to implement. It's important for you to remember that because 90% of the funding in K-12 education in this country comes from the state and local level, not the federal government. The cost that we came up with for the national figure was $16 billion, and for Massachusetts it'll be $350 million. Again, we got $250 million from the federal race to the top, and it's going to cost $350 million to implement Common Core, and only a small portion of the $250 million that we got through the top is dedicated to Common Core. There's other dimensions of it that I'll go in more detail, but that gives you an overview of the research we've done.
I'm holding in my hand the document I use when I teach my students every day. It's the Massachusetts Curriculum Framework for English Language Arts and Literacy. It incorporates the Common Core state standards for English Language Arts, and it also outlines the standards in literacy for history and social studies, science, and the technical subjects. And as you can see from my post-it notes, it's a living, breathing document that guides the decisions I make for myself and my students, and for the classrooms that I have responsibility for, grades 7 through 12. I consider the Massachusetts Curriculum Frameworks a list of the information about English language arts concepts in reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language that students should know, and the ELA skills that our students should be able to demonstrate independently by the end of each grade level. For our students, just passing a grade with 60 and moving to the next classroom isn't enough. Our students need to master complex skills with proficiency, and that's what these standards indicate. What is the end of the year proficiency that my students need to be able to achieve as readers and writers, speakers and listeners, and folks who use language, who learn academic language and vocabulary, and also learn the conventions of standard written English. I consider this like a staircase that tells me at the end of this year, my students, if they are proficient, should be able to move up to the next stair. So what does that mean in the middle school? It means in grade 6, for the first standard, which is key ideas and details, that students in grade 6 should be able to identify the main ideas, the things that are both explicit and between the lines in what they read. When they go to grade 7, they should be able to identify several pieces of evidence that support a theme or a thesis. And when they go to grade 8, they should be able to know which of those pieces is the strongest piece of evidence. When they come up to the high school in grade 9, they need to know when the evidence that they have collected about what they have read is thorough. And in grades 11 and 12, they need to know both what the text says and what the text doesn't say. As writers, they need to be able to state a thesis themselves and supply evidence from what they read, what they think, what they imagine. And each year, they are responsible for presenting more evidence, thorough evidence. They are supposed to be able to recognize the bias in evidence, and they're supposed to be able to target an audience who really cares about what they're able to say and express. Now, in English language arts, we have classics still, we have fables, we have Bible chapters and stories, we have myths still, we have traditional stories, young adult novels, we have classics. My freshmen are finishing reading the Odyssey. They've read Romeo and Juliet this year. My juniors have read the Declaration of Independence. They just finished reading The Great Gatsby. My sophomores read memoirs. And these are texts that I can choose from here. Every time these standards say text, it means one of many different genres I can choose from. But it also holds responsible my colleagues in science and social studies when they give out those heavy books that students take home in backpacks. And when we think about replacing them with electronic texts that are lighter, what we really should be concerned about is, can they read their textbooks themselves? Do they depend on worksheets and PowerPoint outlines? Can they find main ideas themselves independently? Because once they cross the stage and receive that diploma, they need to be able to read complex texts on their own, and they need to be able to write and express their own ideas that integrate what they learn from what they read. And in the Common Core, as it's represented in the Massachusetts curriculum framework, I believe I have a roadmap for that, to guide my students, to guide my colleagues, and to guide my district. So that is what the Common Core state standards are for me and in my role. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is probably my 53rd or 54th forum going across the state talking about both the Common Core and about PARCC, and they've been vibrant discussions. I'm really thrilled at the number of parents in particular and sometimes students who come and really want to understand what's going on. And facts matter. So I'll actually spend a couple of minutes going through state statute laws that guide what our department does, what the Board of Elementary and Secondary Ed does, what the genesis of all of this is, and how it brought us to today. And I'm going to try to move through that quickly, so I'll stay under my 5 minutes, Representative.
5 minutes, Tom.
So let's start with Common Core is about standards. It is not about curriculum. It's about standards. What are standards? What are the Common Core standards intended to do? They provide a description, as Liz was describing, of what our students need to know and be able to do to succeed while they're in school and for success after high school. Massachusetts first adopted standards for student learning 20 years ago, so we've been at this for a while. The Education Reform Act of 1993, passed by our legislature, signed into law by the governor, made standards the foundation upon which all curricular and teaching are built in our Commonwealth. So that is the design of the law that set our state on a course that's made it first in the nation. So the Ed Reform Law served our students well, and I appreciate the structure of the questions. When we get to number 4, I'll get to speak to that in greater detail. Standards by state law are a state responsibility, and we're charged with setting and adopting standards of the highest rigor and quality. Standards are not curricular, and in Massachusetts, curriculum is the responsibility of each local school district, and that is an important part of local control of education. Further, state standards do not control how our teachers teach. The material instruction is controlled by our teachers. So what our students need to know and be able to do are the standards, but they come to life both through curricula and through teaching at the local level. So the first standards in English language arts and math were adopted in the mid-1990s. It involved extensive outreach to educators across the state. Also, by that same statute, by that same law, these standards are to be updated and improved periodically. So Massachusetts currently has 8 curriculum frameworks. 2 of them we're speaking about in depth tonight: English language arts, mathematics. It also includes science, history, and social science. It includes the arts and others. And in our state alone, 44 vocational technical fields, Massachusetts alone in doing that. The first major revisions were made to the math frameworks in 2000 and to English language arts in 2001. This was led by department staff and other experts. We had feedback from hundreds of educators from across the state, and that process was led by Dr. Stotsky and then Commissioner of Education David Driscoll. And as Dr. Stotsky pointed out, they are cited as among the strongest in the nation. The Ed Reform Law directs our board to update and improve the standards. In 2009, our current commissioner, Commissioner Mitchell Tester, convened 2 committees, one in English language arts, one in math, to pre-K through grade 12 educators from across the state and higher education faculty to review our current standards and to once again update and improve them. As these committees became aware of work being done by the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, all of whom are accountable to the public, to develop the Common Core standards, they became intrigued, studied, evaluated them, and concluded that what was emerging in that process wasn't where we'd like it to be, but it was strong enough that we should spend some more time diving into what they found. They liked most of what they found. They found that the first draft of the Common Core standards already had incorporated much of what we had done in Massachusetts. Second, the draft addressed a number of concerns that we were beginning to become aware of about our prior standards. For example, deeper analytic writing that compares 2 or 3 texts rather than writing from memory from single text, which is what we do in MCAS today, and a sharper focus on learning math standards. Third, when we started talking to the authors of the standards about our interests, we were invited deep into the process, and many of our staff, the same staff that Dr. Stotsky worked with, creating the standards in 2000 and 2001, became part of the process, helped improve the Common Core standards, and in the process, we learned as well.
Let's stop you there, and then you guys can start out here. We'll start with you on the next question, which you're kind of leading into as well anyway, so we'll keep it going. So the second question that I have is, since this has already been accepted by the Massachusetts Department of Education, Common Core has already been adopted and raised to the top, what does this mean for Massachusetts schools? What must they do? What flexibility do they have in designing their own curriculum? And what other future projections are going to be, and requirements are going to be needed for the schools, either from a technology standpoint or from a curriculum standpoint? And we'll start with Bob, so you can keep going.
Okay, so I'll just wrap up the last part and move into the second question, Representative. So our Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, again, consistent with the statute, with the law, put these standards out for comment. And we received extensive comments. The committees that included educators had vetted them. They were voted to be adopted in June of 2010. They directed our board staff to go back out and gather more comments, whether there are gaps in the standards, and additional standards were adopted in December of 2010. Now, one of the big shifts in how the standards will have an impact on our schools and our students is the standards previously were adopted as if K-12 education was a closed universe. Let's look at what it is that students do in art schools and what they need to do better. We came up with very rigorous standards, and our schools and teaching and learning improved. The Common Core standards started with a different point, and that was conversations with professors of freshman English and math in our colleges. And what we heard was where these standards were not serving us as well as they need to. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of standards. We'll pick one up from grade 2. It's to fluently add and subtract within 20 using mental strategies. By the end of grade 2, know from memory all sums of 2 one-digit numbers. This is about what students need to be able to do. It does not tell the district what the curriculum should be, and it doesn't tell teachers how to teach it, but fluency in math, as we all know, is key. And unlike MCAS, which does not test fluency, PARCC will. A 6th grade standard, again from math. Math is my background. Solve real-world and mathematical problems by graphing points in all 4 quadrants of the coordinate plane. Include use of coordinates and absolute value to find distance between points with the same first coordinate or the same second coordinate. This is part of the early foundations that get students on track to move into a STEM role and to take on calculus, that approach to graphing. So each school is free to develop curriculum based on standards like this, and we see very strong examples emerging since 2010 when these standards were adopted. Teachers, as Liz has spoken to in English language arts, are making it come to life in our classrooms. There are a couple of points that I want to address because there's a lot of misinformation out there. There are research studies that come out of Pioneer about eliminating literature and poetry. This is not true. As you just heard from Liz, it's not true in our schools. It's not what's happening to curriculum and to teaching. This all hinges on a question that we may get into about balance of literary and informational text. Both are very important. They're not in opposition to each other, and the way this is organized will not diminish the focus on literary works that we all have experienced in our learning and our children deserve to learn from as well. Other misinformation, the costs. Well, the 2000 standards and 2001 standards were exactly the same process as we see today. Earlier standards were changed. It is a joint process between the state, local districts, and schools that we all need to learn to get better. It's a process of continuous improvement. Our state did this in glorious fashion in 2000 and 2001. We'll do so again in 2014, 2010 to today. Second, eliminating paths to calculus. I'll come back to this in question 5. That is not correct either.
I'd like to continue to share with you how the frameworks play out in public schools. The first thing that I can tell you about is that we are continuing to use the same texts, poems, plays, novels, and anthologies which incorporate that literary nonfiction that we have always read, important political documents, speeches such as JFK's inaugural speech and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, things like King's letters, the letter from the Birmingham jail, Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie's, photo essays, and fine American art. The 70-30 split that's outlined in the NAEP table is not what happens in an English language arts classroom. We are not, over my dead body, taking the 70% of literature out and leaving us with 30. And that's not fair. What the standard asks us to do is to say to our colleagues in history, science, social studies, art, foreign language, what you do counts as reading of information also. Our English language arts teachers must keep in mind what students need to know and be able to do by the end of the school year, and they need to put sufficiently complex text before them so that they can improve their reading comprehension, and to put significantly complex writing tasks before them so that they can become more proficient writers. I am free to make responsible choices. If I look at my 1996 and 2001 standards in the Massachusetts frameworks, there are no texts mentioned whatsoever. However, there's a wonderful appendix that gives me a list of classic and traditional works, British and European work, as well as American heritage texts that I should share with my students. And this curriculum framework has a wonderful list at the end of it, including maybe 20 years more of new texts that we should consider by authors who are wonderful as well. I will teach literary nonfiction as I always have, and I look at my colleagues in other content areas to teach students how to read science, how to read social studies, how to read lab reports, how to read primary source documents. I do want to say there's one advantage. I don't know if there are any active military or people who serve in the National Guard, but I'm the daughter of a Vietnam vet and an Army brat who went to 6 schools by the time I was in 6th grade. I was introduced to fractions in grades 3, 4, 5, and 6 at 4 different schools. And if perhaps that there was some kind of shared curriculum about grade level expectations, I might have been a math major instead of an English major. But that's another story. So I'd like to speak out for some continuity. Even if you're not a military family, so many people in this economic time are forced to move from one community to another, from one family home to another, and it would be a great source of comfort if they were sharing curriculum standards, and what they had learned in one school would be continued in another, and that standard of reading comprehension and writing would be somewhat similar. Certainly, though much of the curriculum standards sort of hint at the kinds of texts that students should read, there is a great amount of responsible choice. For me as a classroom teacher in my anthology, as a department head in my district, And there is some room for me to share my favorite Emily Dickinson poem when we study the poetry of that time period. There is time for me to share which of John Donne or Shakespeare's sonnets that we are going to read. I have a choice between Hamlet and Othello when I teach my seniors. It's important that they have an experience of Shakespearean tragedy. But I know what's sufficiently complex. I know what's a good fit to my students in my community, what builds upon what has worked they have had in the past. And one of the things that I am really grateful for with these frameworks is that it has caused a discussion to happen between colleges and universities about what our students need to know and be able to do. And lest you say, well, not everyone's going to a college and university, most of our students who enter technical fields need to have a command of language and vocabulary that is 2 grade levels higher than they are right now. So our students need to read sufficiently complex work. I am tired of students trying to calculate how low a grade they can get and how low they can keep their academic pulse to get out of a grade with a 60. Because truth be told, the reason so many students, even in Massachusetts, end up taking remedial coursework in their freshman year in college is they slumped out of grades 11 and 12 with a 60. Our students who take advanced placement coursework and our students who have set their sights on competitive colleges work hard right to the finish line. With these standards, I really hope that all of our students will have the option to make that choice and be encouraged to do so when they get their diploma. Thank you.
So both Bob and I have referenced the Massachusetts Education Reform Act of 1993, and the 2 main authors of that ed reform bill were Republican Governor Bill Weld and former Senate President Tom Birmingham. They both, in 2010, and also about a year or so ago, when the ed reform law was celebrating its 20th anniversary, made it clear again that they were opposed to Massachusetts adopting the Common Core. So the intent of the people that 2 of the 3 co-authors of this historic education reform law were opposed. Frankly, they were really perplexed why Massachusetts adopted it all. Bill Weld described it, Common Core, as a muddle-headed mediocrity, is what he described. Tom Birmingham thought it was a remarkable shame that they had ignored the evidence of the historic accomplishments of education reform, ignored the evidence from the international PISA exam that shows that the commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama matters dramatically, because the reality of it is that the quality of the language and vocabulary found in literature, poetry, and drama is just qualitatively better than what the informational text and non-fiction approach that Common Core proposes. And while it was mentioned that teachers may have the flexibility at the school level to implement it as they see fit, what is specifically different about the way in which ed reform, as we've previously known it in Massachusetts, is from what we have going forward, is that teacher evaluations were not driven by the race to the top and by the PARCC testing. And so while teachers may now have some flexibility, as the teacher evaluations, which will very likely be aligned with the PARCC testing that I think that everyone recognizes Massachusetts will very likely adopt, the teacher in Pittsfield may teach Moby Dick. But if it's not in the standards, and it's not on the test, and it won't be, because the fact is that Massachusetts doesn't control the PARCC test by itself. It is now just one of 15 or 17 other states. And while we used to own the table for the MCAS test, we have a seat at the table. So we have to sit down and negotiate with Louisiana and with Arkansas and Mississippi about what it is that is the substance of the standards themselves, because they are a part of the adoption of Common Core, but also the PARCC testing itself. So what's also clear about the PARCC testing and the 2 testing consortia in their federal applications, again, to receive frankly, illegal funds from the federal government, is that it says right in both of the Smarter Balance and PARCC testing applications that they will develop curricular materials, again, a violation of federal law. So I don't think that anyone believes that if you control the standards and you control the tests And the feds have also set up a technical advisory board for the testing consortia and dictated in the application that the curriculum will not fall in the middle, and that when the teacher evaluations are aligned up to it, we're going to have very little autonomy. Again, the thing that's important to remember, and it's again why the architects of ed reform were opposed to it, is that the 3 evaluations that Commissioner Chester and the Board of Education relied upon for the adoption of Common Core, the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, the Fordham Institute, and Achieve Inc., guess who funded them to do those evaluations? The Gates Foundation, who also paid for, guessed it, the development of the standards themselves. This is hardly an impartial or objective process. In terms of the substance of the standards, this is a line from Mark Bauerlein, who is a professor of literature at Emory University and conducted an evaluation of Common Core's ELA with Dr. Stotsky. We could find no research to support the assertion that substituting informational text for literature will improve students' college readiness, said Professor Bauerlein. In fact, experience suggests that exactly the opposite is likely to happen. So what will it mean in your classroom? And I'm seeing it already with my own daughter, is that there is some things in there in Common Core that are comparable. But there's a lot less of the classic literature, poetry, and drama, which has been the secret recipe. I'll say one final piece on the mathematics side, because as I mentioned, the quality is poor there. But I'm not going to rely on our opinions on it. I'm going to read you the opinions of the people that are the advocates and the people that oversaw the evaluations of the Common Core for the Fordham Institute. His name is Stephen Wilson. He's a professor of math professor at Johns Hopkins. He told this to the Baltimore Sun. Wilson was quoted as saying that while Common Core's math and standards are vastly better than most states, they are nowhere near as good as the top states. Massachusetts is a top state. In 2010, before the Massachusetts State Board of Education, Jason Zimba, the lead author of and writer for the math standards, said this: they prepare students for colleges most kids go to, but not for the colleges most parents aspire to, and added that the standards are not for selective colleges. Finally, Bill McCallum, another lead writer on the Common Core in 2010, was quoted as saying this: the overall standards would not be too high, certainly not in comparison to other nations, including East Asia, where math education excels. These are the people that wrote the standards themselves, and they have very, very poor things to say about them.
Thank you. Let me begin first, very quickly, by describing the tenets of my own philosophy at the time we were developing the K-12 standards, or revising them, 1999 to 2003. What was in them that helped or contributed to the seemingly miraculous increase in achievement in Bay State students? First, we emphasized where we could content knowledge. This is not an emphasis in Common Core in any way. We also believe very strongly in trying to ensure that all kids would do better. We weren't particularly interested one way or the other whether gaps closed. We weren't trying to go this way. We were trying to go this way for all kids. And third, and this is the related piece that has been totally missing from the picture today from Washington, D.C., we tried to do what we could to strengthen prospective and practicing teachers. Because if you have or want first-class standards taught in the classroom, you need academically stronger teachers, particularly in math and science, than we have had for almost 50 years. And so this was the thrust of a lot of the work that I was trying to coordinate, trying to get all of these different pieces together. The big question that has to be asked by every superintendent and school committee in Massachusetts as well as in other states are Common Core's standards in English and language arts, English language arts and math, better or as good as what was there before. And it turns out that there are a number of states, as I am discovering in testifying before state legislatures and looking up their standards, that certainly Massachusetts had among the best standards, and we have gone down in the quality of what we now have. The green book that you see there is the same color as the old English Language Arts Standards book we had, but the contents are Common Cores. So even though it's called Massachusetts Standards, those are Common Cores if they are dated after 2010. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any confusion about that book compared to the others. Now, how do we know that the math standards are not as good? You've heard a few quotes from the writers of Common Core's math standards to begin with. They themselves said at an open meeting, one of them, Jason Zimba, that these standards were minimal readiness for college. That isn't where Massachusetts has been for many, many years. We also know from Professor Milgram's work, he was on the Common Core Validation Committee with me. He's a mathematician at Stanford. He has said that the high school standards need complete reorganization and revision because they do not prepare students for STEM careers. Now, what you need to understand is that Common Core's math standards as standards basically end at a weak Algebra 2 level. And in order to get to Calculus 1, which is approximately the beginning of the freshman sequence for math majors, science majors, computer science majors, economic majors, engineering majors, more and more four-year majors in technical areas begin with more advanced math and science coursework. It won't happen with Common Core's math standards unless your local community does something about it. This is your local math department, your local science department, and your superintendent and school committee who are going to have to make sure that that advanced coursework that was part of what you had in your high school before stays there, even though it will not be supported by Common Core, because as the vice president of the College Board has said, Common Core's math does not support a math sequence to calculus. That may not be what you want for high school graduation requirements, but it certainly is the pathway to the 21st century and the jobs of the 21st century. Now, what can we say about the tests? The old MCAS, I don't know to this day exactly what the status of MCAS
Stosky,
is.
you're going to move into the next question? PARCC is being proposed to replace MCAS. It was debated by existence on the Norfolk School Committee. What are the advantages and disadvantages between the two documents? If you could describe some of the reasons why we're moving to the PARCC standard, and hasn't been completely decided, but I know Commissioner Chester.
There's apparently, and Bob Bickerton can say more about any details relating to department policy than I can at this point. But PARCC is the test that is being developed by a testing consortium of which, as you've heard, Massachusetts is one of any number of members. Problems with the ELA, and I'm going to say this very quickly because I was involved with MCAS and why I think the MCAS ELA should be retained. I can make the same argument for math, but MCAS in ELA was based on the judgment of high school English teachers in this state for selection of passages. And those development committees, assessment development committees, and I sat in on the first ones that were put into place back in 98, 99, asked for 60% of literary passages for the MCAS tests. 40% informational, 60% literary. You would have to see those passages because they are up there still on the web. You are not going to see released items with PARCC. As far as we know, you may see some sample items, but under state statute, for MCAS, every year test items have to be released. So parents and others can see what the quality of those reading selections are, and I used to look every year, even when I was no longer in the department, to see the kinds of passages that were chosen. We just don't know, and we won't ever know, because those passages will not be released. We have lost control of the quality of the test because we have no way of checking to see what will be there. So we are going to be in the dark. This was a non-transparent operation from the beginning, and it will remain non-transparent except for the scores that will be made available based on criteria that were determined behind scenes. And so you have to think about what coursework you think should be available in your schools for your children when they get to high school, because that is where it's going to make a difference whether you have Common Core standards or retain or return to your your older standards, and then whether you continue with MCAS tests, as there are some communities now in Massachusetts deciding they want to do, because PARCC is an unknown quantity and will always be unknown. I'll stop right there because I think we should hear more information first.
So again, I think it's worth reiterating. Massachusetts is #1 in the country on the NAEP test. It's really like winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 games each time. And then we, in 2007 and 2013, tested as our own individual country. Our 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science. Even the architects of the Education Reform Act never could have imagined this historic accomplishment. The international comparisons is like winning Olympic gold medals. So what do we know about MCAS? What we know is that it correlates with historic gains on both national and international tests. Bob himself, and I think everyone across this debate on every side of it, would acknowledge that the MCAS is the gold standard in standardized testing in this country. The problem that we have, I think, with the PARCC testing is that much of it really remains in a black box. It is being developed by Achieve Inc. Achieve Inc. is a spin-off, really, of the Governors Association, which again is basically a lobby group, a DC-based lobby group. And guess what? Achieve Inc. has never developed student assessments before. They have done work for many, many years and pushed for a long time, but the fact is, in the area of standards, but the fact is, and they ran a thing called the American Diploma Project, which had 25 or 30 states. But the fact is that Achieve Inc., like the Governors Association, like the Council of Chief State School Officers, like the Gates Foundation, like the Fordham Institute, all these organizations that are driving Common Core, guess what? What do they share in common? They haven't improved student achievement anywhere in 25 years. So we have given up what is demonstrably a successful model for something that is A, a black box, B, driven by trade organizations in Washington, D.C., that are private organizations. I have tried, believe me, if you try to do a Freedom of Information Act search to Achieve Inc., or to PARCC, or to the Governors Association, or the Council of Chief State School Officers, they're private organizations, they're lobby groups, their members are public officials. But these trade organizations, let me tell you, are not. They are private organizations and not subject to any open records. In terms of the testing itself, as I mentioned earlier, the fact is that teachers, and this is a reality of all standardized testing, over time teachers will teach to the test. And as I mentioned, all the key ingredients, or many of the key ingredients, I should be careful about that, many of the key ingredients that were built into the success of the MCAS test and the previous standards, really those facts and those evidences of our success really have been ignored. They talk a lot about how we've had a big impact, but when you're cutting classic literature and poetry and drama by 60% by what we had before, you're ignoring this historic record. You're ignoring the record of high standard states like California. You're ignoring the record of East Asian countries. And what do we know from the analysis? Because the reality of it is that there has not been any cost projection on any of this. The budget office for the state, the Office of Administration and Finance, the governor's office, the Board of Education, the Department of Education, they've not done a cost projection on it. The representative knows full well that if there's any regulations or any laws that have cost connected with it, it needs to start in the House Ways and Means office, all right, and committee. This didn't happen. There were no hearings, there were no bills, there was no public discussion. And what's troubling about this, and it's exemplified by the testing itself, is that this is really not a transparent process. In a strict sense of it, they have circumvented Congress because there were no bills or hearings about national tests in Congress on this topic. There were no bills or hearings in the legislature. So this is governors, and it is the executive branch at the national level that are pushing this. And they really have circumvented the taxpayers who will pay for this. And what we know is that the technology costs are going to be significant. We know that the professional development around this is going to be significant. And we know that adopting, whether you say in your community, if you bought new textbooks in 2009 and Massachusetts adopted Common Core in 2010, guess what? All those textbooks are thrown away because the fact is that these are entirely different standards, entirely for different tests. And so all the teaching and professional development connected with that, it's like the year zero. It's all wiped away. It's re-hitting the start button.
I guess I have to speak from Yankee frugality in Abington, but we haven't thrown away a single textbook. We can't afford to throw them away. And when we look at the titles in our textbook, most of the titles that are there remain in the appendix of suggested reading for each grade level from kindergarten through grade 12. Also, we are not cutting any of the literature in Abington that we teach. We are inviting our history, science, social studies, foreign language, arts teachers to the table as instructors and builders of content area literacy. I want to stress again that the frameworks that I received with the blue cover in 1996 had not one single title mentioned in any of the standards. They were all mentioned in the appendix. But lest I stray from the question, I want to go back to the question. What did I like about MCAS? What are the advantages and disadvantages of this test in PARCC? First of all, I was scared to death of MCAS, as were all our students, because we had never been measured by an external standard before. There was a great deal of anxiety among our best students. But what I like about MCAS, it was a measure of equity. MCAS didn't come in an honors version, a standard version, and a remedial version. Everybody took the same test. So you know what? We did have to teach to the test. Students who had never read novels before or who had never been expected to write more than a paragraph, teachers had to differentiate instruction and make sure students were able to do those things. So thank you to MCAS for putting those tasks before all students to open the doors of higher education to all students. That was what was really important to me about MCAS. And the longer I gave it, and I saw our advanced and proficient rates rise from students 10 years ago we wouldn't expect to achieve, I was really proud of that. And the numbers of students who were able to attend college from Abington increased. And they were able to go on and do well. I'm also grateful that the conversation around MCAS prompted our relationship with teacher prep programs at Bridgewater State College, now University, to grow. I do want to speak to you about what some of the PARCC items look like and to dispel some of the information that you have received, because I have seen sample items, I have seen practice tests, I have seen the texts, I have talked about the texts. So first, let me tell you about the first item that I saw as a grade 10 sample item. It was Ovid's myth of Daedalus and Icarus. Students were asked to read it and then trace the way it influenced poet Anne Sexton in her poem, To a Friend Whose Work Has Come to Triumph. That was a grade 10 task. And that grade 10 task, for me, because I teach advanced placement literature and composition, comes square out of an advanced placement literature prompt where students are asked to compare literary text to trace the impact of one allusion on the other. What my 10th graders are writing to now is a prompt that goes something like this. In a novel you have read, in or outside of school, find a character who has suffered greatly. What have they suffered, and what does the suffering contribute to the overall meaning of the text? And you know what? They're not allowed to bring the text in with them. They don't quote. If anyone has ever told them a story, if they have seen it in a movie, As long as they write 5 healthy paragraphs that are remotely well organized, they'll receive a proficient grade. What PARCC does every time a student writes, it puts text before them, much like our open response items, which I think would have an impact on PARCC's development. The one kind of item that PARCC puts before us that we put only before advanced placement language and composition students is a synthesis-based question. Students have to read 2 or 3 texts, and they have to answer a question and supply quotes. So a student whose memory is stronger is not privileged. A student whose reading experience is wider is not privileged. Everybody has the same texts to use to make the case for their answer. And for me, that levels the playing field. Our students will have to be able to write argument. They will have to be able to write an information text. And I'm so excited that in the grade 6 sample items, they get a passage from Julie of the Wolves, and they actually have the task of writing a creative narrative. So for the first time, we get to teach creative writing, craft, and structure as part of our curriculum, and that is something that the previous Massachusetts frameworks have never done. Actually, I want to speak just a minute to the technology, if I have a minute. 10 seconds?
How about 10 seconds for technology?
Text include videos. All multiple choice are 2-part. They have to drag and drop the evidence from the text into a second part of a question to prove where they got the answer rather than just guess. So the technology is a real asset to us. Thank you for the 10 seconds.
Okay, so picking up on why PARCC is not being proposed but is being considered to replace MCAS. I mentioned this in my opening comments. Our state and our state alone is taking PARCC for a 2-year test drive. We did field testing and still are completing some field testing this spring to see if the items are good enough. But next year, districts will have a choice of selecting MCAS or PARCC, and we will let them go head-to-head and make a decision, is PARCC a better assessment than MCAS or not? And as Mr. Gass has pointed out, that sets the bar very high because MCAS is the best of the current legacy tests. It's often described as one of the best. I take exception to that because for many years now, I've been responsible for ensuring the rigor and quality of MCAS. I work very closely with my staff who put MCAS out every year with enormous diligence and pride. Those same staff are vetting PARCC items, are helping to construct the PARCC tests. There is no other entity. Achieve has nothing to do with putting together PARCC tests. It is led in many of the committees in PARCC by Massachusetts staff, and the educators who are vetting these items, in large part of Massachusetts educators in our schools at the grade levels looking and saying, are these items good enough? And our assessment staff are just as diligent about PARCC as MCAS, and they remain skeptical. It has to be better or we do not adopt it. So MCAS has served us exceptionally well. It is the best of the current generation of assessments, but let's remember, MCAS has served this role in our state for 17 years. Do we need to take a look at different ways of doing some of the assessments? So here's some of the things we've learned, some shortcomings about how MCAS has served us. The first is we have some pretty intractable proficiency gaps among poor students, among our racial and ethnic minorities, among our linguistic minorities. There's a big gap in performance, and that's a gap that we are committed to close. We're working hard to close it. We've made progress, just not enough yet. And it's not clear that our prior standards or our prior assessments were getting us over that hurdle. A very important piece that we've learned, because we now can look at what happens to our students when they leave high school and go on to public higher education. We're able to watch what happens when they become freshmen. Too many of our graduates, students who did everything that was asked of them, are unprepared for college. 1 out of every 3 high school graduates in the Commonwealth who go into public higher education in our state end up in remedial education. And when we get to question 4, I'll address more what the consequences are. It's very challenging for those students. MCAS does not give our teachers timely results. It's, you get your results in the following school year, essentially. That's when parents get them, that's when the teachers get them, and you're working with new students by the time you see those results. With PARCC, we will have 2 things that change about time. A, results will be available not in the first year when we have to do standard setting, but thereafter, within June, so that teachers will have results while they still have the students. Second, there will be formative tools available for teachers to use as they choose, as they decide, not the state. Diagnostic assessments and other tools will help them understand if students are working on grade level, or if they need additional support, or they're ready to go ahead. There is extended writing on both MCAS and PARCC. The difference is the extended writing in MCAS is only in 4th grade, 7th grade, and 10th grade. PARCC will have extended writing in every grade from grade 3 to 11. PARCC, as Liz mentioned, with the performance assessments that she was describing in English language arts, they will also exist in math, will let us go much deeper. The current architecture of MCAS just doesn't let us go that deep into standards that are essential for our kids to thrive and succeed as they go from grade to grade and when they go on into college.
Is that a good break?
Am I done, or do I?
5 minutes, so I figured you took a breath, so you're going to jump right in.
All right, so now that's what I covered so
You'll
far.
get to start right up again, because we'll just stay on the same format. So just moving on to question number 4. Currently, as everyone has said, Massachusetts is #1 in the nation as far as education is concerned. Why are we going with a nationalized standard as opposed to continuing to build upon our own model and control our own destiny? I know even with the race to the top, we have the option of accepting Common Core standard or creating our own standard that the U.S. DOE would accept.
So we are enormously proud of the fact that our state has been at the top nationally, and it's right banging on the door at the top internationally. I want to be clear, the lion's share of credit for that goes to teachers in the Commonwealth who day in and day out give everything they have for our students to succeed. So back to NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as the Nation's Report Card. 10 years now, 5 administrations every 2 years. Our 4th and 8th graders are at the top. When we look at TIMSS, which is a math and science assessment given nationally, and PISA, which is very interesting. It's for 15-year-olds, and it has more real-life, really intricate problems for students to solve. Again, Massachusetts right at the top. So let me return to the point I was making a moment ago about what happens, though, with our students who are doing so well when they live within a K-12 curriculum, and then they have to go out to the world, and we want them to succeed. They want them to do better than we did, right? That's the definition of the American dream. We have 1 out of 3 going into public higher ed in remedial classes. What happens when you end up in remedial classes, or what's called in our state developmental education? Your chances of earning a college diploma plummet. If you take 2 remedial courses while you're in college, public higher ed, you have only a 20% chance of getting a diploma when you go to college. That's huge. Out at the table, there are some documents. I hope you look at them. Among them is a data report our department developed, and you can look up your community, where you are, where your kids are going to school. Here in Norfolk, we're doing pretty well. 14.7% of the kids who go into public higher ed end up in remedial classes. But when we go to Attleboro, it's over 27%. That's more than 1 out of every 4 kids in public higher ed. Brockton, it's almost half of all kids. Easton, again, more than 1 out of every 4. That is not giving our students what they need and deserve. The standards were developed to backward map from what it takes to succeed when you're a freshman in college to what we need to do in our schools to help them get there. Items will be released. It is actually much more transparent, as Mr. Gass knows. Our department gets freedom of information requests all the time. Every communication that I have with PARCC and the other states is right out there. I want to make the point that Massachusetts cannot stay first by holding pat. You don't stay first by failing to innovate, failing to do continuous improvement. It's what we're committed to. My staff are the ones helping to build the best items they can in MCAS and in PARCC, and it is a competition which are going to be better, and we will make that a transparent process for all of you to know, have we succeeded?
I'd like to continue and say that although the process in Massachusetts has been transparent, it is not wholly transparent. And as someone who is responsible for reporting to my school committee about items in grades 7 and 8, the state of Massachusetts has been withholding items on grades 7 and 8 because they are in the process of moving the test toward the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, and some of those items are still in development. I do not see every passage on MCAS because some authors have not given their copyright for the public to consume over the internet, but only for use during a test. So in any test, students also take items that are test items, and their scores on those items are not reported. I truly think that my SAT scores were severely impacted by that because I probably did better on the test items than the real items. But let me put that aside. I want my students to have more skills than MCAS currently measures in English language arts. And although I'm proud to be from Massachusetts, I am also proud to work with my colleagues. In Massachusetts, I work with the South Shore department heads. I work with the International Reading Association, the Massachusetts Reading Association, the New England Association of English Teachers, and NCTE. And when we tackle a problem together, we achieve great results. So when I work nationally with my colleagues in the PARCC states, when I go to meet them on a regular basis, I learn from my colleagues in other states. Massachusetts doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. If there is a state who has information about English language learners and has already done that work and research, then we can borrow from it. They can look at the work we've done on writing, how frustrating it is, for instance, when I sat at a table with someone from Tennessee who had never had their students write on a statewide assessment ever. And I could say, well, in Massachusetts, this is what we do. And I guess maybe this analogy works. The rising tide lifts all boats. And if Massachusetts has raised that tide, then the other states, it's all right, come on with us. We can share that information together. I don't think our discussion about MCAS in Massachusetts should be about what makes our state first or best, but what makes American students everywhere first and best. And we get there not by competing with one another, but by collaborating. We are the United States of America, and we are not little federations apart from one another. And I really do think that we can work together as colleagues for the greater good of all our students. So I think it's worth adopting a common standard and sharing the wealth there. And I want to say, relative to technology, when I started as a teacher in 1983, I did so with a manual typewriter, and I typed my work on purple-lined masters. Does anyone here remember what that smells like? I got my first computer in 1987 through the Mac and Apple for a Teacher program. I have to update my computers. I have to update my phone. I have to update the technology that my students need to walk out of the doors of my high school learning. My high schools have to learn to post on a blog because one of the first courses they take in college may be a hybrid web-based class, and I want them to be prepared. And the first time that they see technology in reading and writing should not be on a high-stakes test. And if it takes the high-stakes test as a lever to make sure we teach to a test that incorporates 21st technology, then so be it. I'm willing to teach to that test so that my students will have that experience that is necessary in college. They need to learn how to word process and not just type from their notes. It's different. And they need to know how to process other texts besides just the stable print on page. They need to be able to process graphs and infographics. And sometimes the best way to put those tasks before students is through technology. And whether MCAS goes there itself or it moves and transitions to PARCC, we'll see. But I want the best for my students. And that's why I'm looking for this information and learning about it so that I can contribute to that decision where I believe my voice has impact.
Okay, so I think it's important to give us some context here. The reality of it is that under our system of government and under the U.S. Constitution and the system of federalism that we have in place, the national government, generally speaking, has responsibility for foreign policy and trade and defense and things like that. But that going back to the earliest days of the founding era, and I think the founders were very wise about this, they understood that K-12 education is the proper legal jurisdiction of state and local governments. If people that are advocates of national standards want to empower the U.S. Department of Education to perform that function, the first thing they need to do is repeal the 3 federal laws, 2 of which were signed by Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter. I think they're hardly sort of limited government folks. They would need to repeal those first, but also in point of fact, the U.S. Constitution doesn't mention education really at all, while the state constitutions are very specific about it. The Massachusetts Constitution is the oldest written constitution in the world. It was written by John Adams in 1780. There's several paragraphs in it. It's been the source of some of the legal battles that have shaped the ed reform law in Massachusetts. And while a lot of these DC-based trade organizations have had the aspiration to have national standards testing and curriculum for 20 some odd years and frankly have failed to deliver, many of them have failed to deliver high quality standards at the state level, we've heard from both sides here that the previous mechanisms that we had, the previous standards, previous testing has really made us the best in the country and internationally competitive. In fact, properly said, the race to the top was the race to become Massachusetts, which is precisely why the advocates of Common Core dumped so much money into Massachusetts to make sure that we adopted. So one of the things I want to address is we know the sort of the big picture success, but there's Bob brought up this issue of gaps. What do we know from Massachusetts? And one of the key parts of the Education Reform Act was the charter schools, the independent Commonwealth charter schools. And now it's becoming clear in research paper after research paper, researchers from Harvard and MIT and Duke and Stanford, is that the Massachusetts charter schools, on top of all the other things that we've done, they too are the gold standard. They're gold standard not just in terms of their performance, they're gold standard in terms of bridging achievement gaps. And what did they do so well? They've used all of the tools of the ed reform law, the MCAS, the release of the questions, the standards, the local autonomy, the decision-making at the school level. They use those better than almost any public school in the country in the last 20 years, okay? But it's not just the charter schools, right? Because they're very controversial and independently authorized by our State Board of Education. How about the vocational technical schools that for many, many years were among the lowest performing schools in this state? They embraced this academic focus, the literature focus, the focus on high quality mathematics. Guess what? In the last 7 or 8 years, the research that we have done and the MCAS data makes it clear that they too have seen about a 40% improvement in their academic performance. So it turns out if you want to be an engineer or an auto mechanic or an electrician or a carpenter, that you actually have to have very high quality academic skills. But in terms of this issue of teaching our children about civics, I would argue that there are an enormous number of conflicts of interest that have been circulating around this. Governor Patrick serves on the board of Achieving, which is closely allied with the PARCC. There was a 2010 Channel 5 news stories that I want to just read you a couple lines from. Sean Kelly reported on Wednesday that the past fiscal year, the commissioner, that is Commissioner Chester, took at least 12 trips costing $15,146.80. All those trips have been paid for in part by trade groups and special interest This is a common cause. The appearance that there might be a conflict when you accept free or discounted travel from a party, particularly if they have an interest in the outcome of a decision, is certainly there, said Pam Wilmot from Common Cause, a nonpartisan government watchdog organization. The top sponsors of Chester's trips are two Washington, D.C.-based organizations, Achieve Inc., the Council of Chief State School Officers. Together, they paid for most of Chester's travel to D.C., Chicago, Arizona, and London. So I, too, think that civics matters and transparency matters. I think that most people know that when our commissioner is being flown around the country and frankly, some of our former State Department of Education officials that were key in this decision, that within 6 months after the decision was made, many of them started to migrate to PARCC, to Gates, to a variety of the organizations that are heavily Gates funded. I think this is a horrendous anti-civics lesson for our kids.
Question has been raised as to why we gave up our top-of-the-line standards in English language arts and mathematics in 2010. And a very simple answer is we were getting the promise of $250 million in Race to the Top money. That was the reason we gave up our good standards. We hadn't solved all of the educational problems of our schools by then, and it's unlikely that any set of standards by themselves or any set of tests based on those standards could do such a thing. Excuse me, I'm getting closer to this. But we have to think about what we're missing in the current standards we have, which, by the way, are not revisable at this point, so far as we know. We have right now adopted copyrighted standards. They have been copyrighted by the organizations that created them. There is no mechanism for revising them. When we had our own state standards, we were able, as Bob indicated before, to revise them on a timely basis as state statute required. Cannot be done with Common Core. No one knows how Common Core's standards that have been frozen into concrete with all of their flaws can be revised in the future, since the project itself is no longer being funded by the Gates Foundation. Standards are out there with their flaws. Let's take a look first at the math standards and the flaws that I am going to use Professor Milgram's comments, because he was the only mathematician on the validation committee who wrote a 13-page critique about why he would not sign off on these standards as being internationally benchmarked, research-based, and rigorous. First of all, at the elementary school level, the standard algorithms are introduced too late. They are introduced, but they're too late. Problem this leads to is that by grade 6, 7, and 8, according to Professor Milgram, who has looked at standards in our competitive Southeast Asian countries, our students are 1 to 2 years behind those students already. By the time they get to high school, they are over 2 years behind their peers. Why? Because they complete all of their basic arithmetic by grade 6, and generally speaking, in most other countries that are industrialized in grade 7 and 8, they do a combination of algebra and geometry, so that by 9, they can begin advanced coursework in math and science. With Common Core's weak high school math standards, we are going to see problems in both science and math. And this is something for those of you who have some knowledge of how to read a set of math standards and science standards need to take a closer look at and speak to your high school math and science people about. Because that is where the greatest damage is going to be done, when you have a topping off of Common Core's math at about a weak Algebra 2 level. Now, why did we buy into this for the sake of college readiness? We need to understand what the quid pro quo was. for going along with that some people thought was going to help this issue of the remediation that is required at the post-secondary level. College readiness meant that if students pass a test in grade 11, as it probably will be given, and are deemed college ready, they get to have credit for freshman courses they take in college. What this means is not yet clear, but those of you who play chess can figure out that if there is a college readiness test, passing score we don't know yet, that is going to consist of no more than weak Algebra 2 content. The test itself for a passing score may be down around grade 8 algebra, low grade Algebra 1 level. Now, if that becomes the next course after that, the credit-bearing course at the college level, yes, you have solved the remediation problem for a lot of students, but you have lowered the level of the math and science that can be taken at the college level for those in four-year sequences if they begin with a low level, as Professor Milgram says, intermediate algebra, or something called college algebra, which to most mathematicians, and I again quote, is remedial algebra 2 with a few little extra things thrown in. Now, this is simply what mathematicians have told me, and I've checked with someone at UMass who's in charge of the Calculus 1 sections there. And this is essentially how he describes what those courses are when they are called college algebra. Now, he is in charge of calculus. You can have discussions about that. But we have to start thinking about what that is going to mean for American high school students and those in Massachusetts in particular, going on from whatever are the top math courses taught, and for the science courses that may or may not, we still don't know because we're not clear how the science standards are going to play out. They're in the middle of being changed, and next generation science standards do not have much of high school chemistry. Scientists have looked at them and said most of high school chemistry is missing, most of high school physics is not teachable because the math isn't there. We may still come out with more standards that are in next generation science standards, but we don't know yet. But we have serious problems with math and science to look at. English is going to be, okay?
The first one, how will Common Core, this is to both of you, PARCC prevent students from checking out in grades 11 and 12 and doing only what it takes to get a 60? If the student isn't motivated now under the current system, how will Common Core change that? Well, that's probably time.
That's certainly something that I brought up. What happens very often is when there is an external standard, students work hard to meet it, particularly when it's connected to graduation. So our grade 10 students work very hard on the grade 10 test because it's high stakes. We think they would continue to work very hard toward a high stakes test that would be necessary for graduation in grade 11, and it is not used to substitute for their freshman course, but to merely function as a placement tool for that grade. So if they know their placement in college plus their high school graduation rides on it, then they will need to not only pass the course in their district, they would need to also score well on the state test.
So, Representative, if I could, I want to pick up on the math side of that question because currently MCAS is in 10th grade and does 10th grade math, and it covers a wide range of standards that under the Common Core now span from 7th and 8th grade through 9th through 10th. It's an end of domain test. It is not an algebra test or a geometry test. What PARCC will bring is a 9th grade Algebra 1 end of course 10th, a 10th grade geometry end of course test, and they could be done in a different sequence if a district decides, and an 11th grade Algebra 2 test. That does not exist currently, and those standards are as strong or stronger than the standards in the 2000 frameworks.
Well, I mean, clearly I'm not a big fan of Common Core, but I think that one of the things that's important,
Really? Are you sure?
I'm on the fence, but But I think the thing that's important, and I think in some of the discussions that we've been in across the country, people that are opponents of Common Core like to blame it for everything from the extinction, to the dinosaurs to, who wins presidential elections, et cetera. But the fact of it is we also shouldn't overpromise on Common Core either. And I don't think that there's any way that we could predict or guess that Common Core will end senior slump, for example. But I guess on the PARCC side of it, the simple fact of it is that we don't know. Bob may know because he is, in a select group of people in the country who has more information than the general public does about it. And we are hearing more and more from teachers that they've been on, I don't know if it's true in this state, but we've heard it across the country that they've been on a gag order not to release or talk about any of the test questions or anything they've experienced or the kids have experienced, any of the pilot testing. And I think that this lack of accountability, this lack of public transparency is a troubling development in our democracy. Everyone knows that the debate around MCAS was a long and protracted and difficult one, but that as was the development of the standards, frankly. But that debate, that public interaction is healthy. And the fact is, and I know because I was the person that commissioned Dr. Stotsky and other people to evaluate the standards, is that they were rolling out these drafts at such an incredible clip. And they adopted them in the summer of 2010 when most people were at the beach or relaxing or barbecue. They thought that the summer of 2010 was a really good time to have a statewide discussion about an entirely new set of standards and potentially new set of tests. And I think that this effort to kind of obscure normal policy-making democratic processes is a very, very troubling development. So again, I think it's important not to be overpromise what this is going to do. We have severe educational problems in this country. We had a long way to go in Massachusetts. We had made an enormous amount of progress. But I think Tom Birmingham said it the best. He was the architect and one of the chief architects of it. He said, if it ain't broken, if it ain't broken, then don't try to tinker with it too much. And I think that's what a lot of what we've seen with this push towards the Common Core and the testing is that we're throwing out a lot of things that are proven that the rest of the country and other countries, in fact, are envious of. And it's a troubling development.
Thank you. This one's addressed to Bob, but anyone can answer. How does Common Core address the economic and ethnic and race gap that you mentioned in your comments, and how it addresses to fix that as opposed to the current standard?
So during the years in K-12 education, promotional decisions are made at the district level. What MCAS has not been able to provide is a signaling device about how ready a student is for the next grade, because each MCAS test focuses only on the grade level standards, whereas PARCC is designed for standards, let me use the phrase, vertically articulated. They're meant to inform how a student's going to be ready for the next grade level. Further, the point I raised earlier about readiness for college, very few parents and very few students understand that they're headed to developmental education, to remedial classes. PARCC is designed to signal that. Now, the heavy lift of then focusing instruction on students that are struggling to be at grade level is in districts, in teachers' classrooms. What PARCC does provide is some additional tools to help answer whether students are in fact able to engage grade level skills or are struggling with an earlier part of a learning progression or are ready to move ahead a year or two beyond their classmates.
Could I just say that we have not had any of this piloted in any way so that we have results from any of the standards or these signaling devices. And a good part of the problem that many people have pointed out is that this was imposed on the entire country and in each state that adopted it, and we just don't know how these things are going to play out. All we have are pious aspirations, for the most part, but we don't know how any of this could possibly close gaps unless there are ways of reducing challenge. And then the question is, what has happened to the rest of the students who are capable of meeting the challenge and who are not being challenged by any of the programs connected to Common Core?
26 years in the department. 26 years in the department has given me, though, a view over time. When MCAS was being developed, it was also not transparent until after it was administered, right? The items are secure. There is no gag order. You're referring, Mr. Gass, to New York State, where the teachers had to sign the same kind of document that teachers who administer MCAS in Massachusetts have to sign, which is you don't disclose the items because not 100% of them are released. That's a change our state made a few years ago. We don't release 100% of items. Neither does New York. It's not a gag item. It's a test. It's secure. You're not supposed to hand the questions out and have people answer them. Now, PARCC will release items the same as MCAS did. This is a process.
Can I just include an actual experience? I assisted a student with special needs who needed direction on the text and pointing back to a test item. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement for any item that I witnessed during the test process, and the notion would be that the individual items that would be released by the state, not by the individual students, and we're instructed not to discuss the items on MCAS. So I want to make sure that you understand that that standard is already in place with MCAS.
Okay. I just want to keep moving on, just get through as many of these as possible. Where do children who are educated under special education fall in regards to these Common Core standards? Whoever wants to go first.
As a teacher, I can tell you they fall in the same place under the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks prior to the Common Core, that students are held responsible for the concepts and the standards. They are given accommodations so that they can have access to text. Students with English language learning have dictionaries, but the idea is it's upon the teacher's responsibility to differentiate instruction so that students will be able to complete the test items themselves. It would be the same process.
So what do we know, under the Massachusetts previous standards and the previous tests? What we know is that the vocational technical schools in Massachusetts have twice the state average of special needs kids. And even given that, they have had a microscopic dropout rate, and it turns out that they have done extraordinarily well.
I think it's very...
Let me finish.
Excuse me.
Let me finish.
I thought you were finished.
So the other thing I guess I'm a little perplexed about is this issue of the college readiness and how MCAS is somehow obsolete and we need to move forward. The reality of it is that there's a thing called the Adams Scholarship, okay? And it was initiated under Governor Romney, but it's also been in place for 7 years under Governor Patrick. So it's under Republicans and Democrats. The Adams Scholarship is awarded by how well kids do on MCAS. It's a scholarship. It's a scholarship for higher education in this state. So are you trying to tell us that we've been awarding sort of fraudulent Adams scholarships for 10 years based on MCAS because it in fact is not a college readiness exam?
I would say that those students who earn the Abigail Adams and John Adams scholarships are the ones who are most likely to be prepared and not to suffer from the slump. I would say, however, though, that vocational schools have changed their admissions procedures, and many of our students who would most profit from a vocational technical program do not have the averages from middle school to attend vocational prep, so they come to the general comprehensive high school. One of the reasons the voc scores have changed is the entire population of students attending voc schools has changed.
So this question has nothing to do with Chris. This is completely false. We don't know who wrote this one. Regarding PARCC, how does the state plan to reimburse districts for the increased technology costs, or will this be an unfunded mandate?
So I want to tackle the issue of technology in two parts. The first is there will be a paper and pencil PARCC test into the foreseeable future if a school is not equipped to be able to administer an online assessment. The paper assessment, all the assessments are paid for by the state. Thank you to the legislature. And there will not be an extra expense. That's the first part of the answer. The second part is our children are in a world where increasingly resources are found online. And it's something we owe to them to give them rich experiences and access to some of the best curriculum available. We have, for example, a contract with WGBH and PBS Learning Media. They're taking all their great videos and series and instructional and the rest, coding them all to the Common Core standards, where our students who have access to online are going to be able to click and get a 3-minute, 5-minute, half-hour treatment of a subject to supplement what they're getting in textbooks. Make it come to life. Engage students in powerful ways. A session on volcanoes. Bring in some of the best information that's out there in a documentary. So PARCC may prove to be a catalyst where districts will increase technology, but we are not first nationally in our ability to give students this access. There is a digital divide in our Commonwealth. There are many schools not ready. They will have a paper and pencil test available to them, but the future harkens. And when you are on any college campus in Massachusetts, we have not found one yet where you don't have to show up with a laptop and an ability to hook online into that college's network.
Could I just quickly say that we still do not know the technological requirements of the new testing program. And the little that we know, and I say that deliberately because all we really have is the experience from Nashua, New Hampshire, where the teachers were asked, and this was not PARCC, it was Smarter Balance, so I do not know what PARCC has done with teachers, but I would urge the towns and communities that are represented here to try to have their teachers take any tests online that before their students do, because what happened in December with the Smarter Balance test that was given in a middle school in Nashua, New Hampshire, was that the teachers were very upset with their experience. They felt it required far more technological expertise than even they had, and that they didn't feel that the test items assessed what they wanted to have taught. So this is still a black box, and I don't know what PARCC has done, but if there's any way we can have teachers report on in advance to the community about the nature of the test, obviously not the test items themselves, we understand they have to be secure, but there has to be a way in which the public gets some feedback from computer adaptive testing.
We have some of that now, actually, if I could. Let me share with you what we do have. The requirements for what schools need to do are posted online. They're publicly available. However, we also have survey results that 37,000 of the 41,000 students who were randomly picked to take the PARCC field test online in March and the beginning of April, well over 80% said they preferred doing the assessment online. They found it interesting. They found it more compelling. In math, that was in English language arts. In math, it was about 60%, I believe. I don't have the report in front of me. There's interest in this. The kids take to this like fish take to water. We do need to do more, and Liz's point earlier, that if they're not getting access to this technology and instruction, they shouldn't be encountering it for the first time on a test. They should be taking the paper and pencil test. But the kids' response was, this is exciting, we like this.
The first thing is that the architects of the Ed Reform Law in 1993 knew precisely what it was going to cost. That all the players, Bill Weld, Tom Birmingham, Mark Roosevelt, knew. We've spent over $100 billion. That was sort of the other end of the Ed Reform side. Pioneer has done a lot of independent research and a lot of work with the Florida Virtual School, which is the best virtual school in the country. and brought Julie Young, who is the leader of that school, to Massachusetts. What I can tell you about Massachusetts, with all this discussion about technology, is that Massachusetts is about 15 years behind Florida Virtual School in the development of online courses. What is also clear is that this idea that it's not going to cost anything to adapt our classrooms to this new technology, I don't know that anyone really believes that, given how far behind we are. And so, Pioneer did the only independent analysis. There was one other analysis done on the cost of Common Core, and it was paid for, you guessed it, by the Gates Foundation. So naturally, they came in with a lower cost, and they excluded, is the Fordham Institute, they excluded the biggest cost driver, which was multi-year technology costs.
I would just invite everybody in this audience to go to www.parconline.org and see the practice tests for yourself. There's a tutorial on how to use the platform, and you can go through tests from grades 3 to 11 and sample the item types for yourself.
Representative, can I ask you a question? I had that we were going until 9:30. Is that correct?
No, I have until 9.
Oh, okay. So I was pacing myself differently. I would just ask, as a matter of some importance to me, that
a little bit, but I don't want to get the
Mr. Gass did launch a personal attack earlier on my commissioner, and I do believe it's worthy of a response before we close the session.
That's absolutely fine, but what I did was read a Channel 5 news story from 2010. There was no personal attack. I was reading you can see it right here, it's a news story from Channel 5. There's no personal attack.
Let's just move on. Next question is, I got quite a few of these. Can you address the data mining of our children's personal information based on the PARCC test? And there were multi-different formats of data mining, but that was the primary one.
So Pioneer just this past week released a report called Cogs in the Machine. It's an 80-page report. It's got 480 footnotes, and it talks a lot about the data collection. I will say that there's no data collection that's built into Common Core standards. It does run parallel to the national testing. The reality of it is that the Achieve Inc. and the Governors Association and many of the drivers of this advocates for Common Core and national standards for decades really have preferred to have K-12 education not really a focus on academics the way we have for the last 20 years in Massachusetts, but they are strong believers in K-12 education as workforce development. Consequently, they believe that they should be gathering the upwards of 400 pieces of personally identifiable data. These state data collection systems were baked into the Race to the Top process, and the U.S. Department of Education and the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has brushed aside the FERPA laws, which are the family privacy laws. The federal government is prohibited from collecting this kind of data, so they've entrusted the states to do it for them. And they also have agreements with the two national testing consortia to share that data with the testing consortia, which are, again, private third-party players in it. But I'd encourage you to take a look at our paper. It is the, I think, definitive paper on this topic.
So I actually had responsibility for a few years to build the data systems that our department currently uses in consort with school districts. There is a fairly large amount of data that moves between school districts and the department, again, governed by both state and federal law. In the state, it's the Privacy Act. On the federal side, it's called FERPA. FERPA was changed. It didn't open this huge door. It did say that when a high school sends a student to a college, for example, the college was entitled for years now to get information about that student. FERPA changed to say the college could actually get some information back to the high school so the high school could figure out, are our curricular interventions, are our courses actually making a difference and working? That's the big change in FERPA. It allows our sending schools to get some of the information back they weren't able to get before. These are rock-solid requirements. I refer to with my staff all the time. No one steps out of line on this. There's a special FERPA jail waiting for you if you do. We have, with our testing vendor, with MCAS, Our testing vendor gets a limited amount of data about students so that they can know which student took the test and when it's scored, who those scores belong to. They are under those same legal requirements. What will go to the PARCC vendor, both for these field tests when we have a choice year next year, and if they continue into the future, will be no different than what we've been sharing since 1997 with our testing vendor for MCAS. That data has been held securely. We honor and respect that. Everyone pays attention to that. These are our children. They have a right to privacy. We fight to maintain it. And any suggestions to the contrary have no basis, in fact, in Massachusetts.
Okay, final question. As a small government, local control guy, this was my personal favorite. Why would you want to have a federal control over local educational standards when the federal programs such as Obamacare and its coordinated websites are nothing but disasters?
So I'm going to use this to respond to the earlier point because I found that personal. I'm going to get to your point because it is not a federal program. The National Governors Association should not be confused with the federal government. It's our governors that are there. 50 states, 50 governors. Now that includes Governor Bill Weld when he was governor. I've worked for 5 different governors over the last several years. The National Governors Association is not the federal government. Part 2, the aspersions cast by reading that article had nothing to do with the serious issues that we're talking about today. We were talking about math at the time, and there were very important points that Dr. Stotsky raised, that I was raising. You need to understand those and make judgments about, are we doing this right or not? And you are part of the jury to help decide, are we doing better standards and are we heading towards a better assessment? That's what's important in today's conversation. The kinds of educational exchanges that not only this commissioner, Commissioner Chester, but I've worked for 4 commissioners. Every one of them has gone on these kinds of exchanges, every one of them sponsored by the Council of Chief State School Officers, and that is not being bought and sold by the fact that the governors or the Council of Chief State School Officers says these exchanges help us learn from other countries, other states, and they come to Massachusetts to learn from us. Frequently, we have a lot to offer. But to engage in that kind of personal attack is exactly to try to bring the kind of debate that we hear in Obamacare nationally into our state, into Massachusetts, where education has always been bipartisan, where we have rallied together to do the best for our students. There is no place for that kind of division, that kind of contention of Obamacare, bringing that to education in Massachusetts. I think it really dishonors the many contributions the Pioneer Institute has made in our Commonwealth in the past.
So,
Could I just say that Secretary of Education Arne Duncan has made the role of USDE quite clear, and I don't think that we need to talk about the governors who go in and out and rotate or lose elections, whatever. They're simply not going to be playing much of a role except the one that we seem to see former Governor Jeb Bush playing in advising other Republican governors about Common Core in their own states. But the point is that it's very clearly something that is being managed from the USDE, and there is nothing to suggest in the entire history of federal initiatives, which I have looked into historically, going back to the middle of the 19th century. There is no initiative to improve student achievement that was ever successful that was undertaken by the federal government. The last one was the Moral Acts of 1862, which gave us our land grants, and those were successful in getting universities built in many states. But since then, we have not had, in 50 years, successful federal programs, and yet Secretary of Education Duncan seems to feel that this is his baby, and the technical design or review committee that he has put into place makes that clear. We haven't heard from that yet, but it doesn't contain one content expert on this committee that is going to be looking into the design of the test elements. Why the USDE appointed these people and why the people it chose were chosen is as much of a mystery as why the writers for Common Core were chosen.
Okay. Jamie, do you have a
Final quick thought. The first thing is that I read verbatim from a Channel 5 news story in November of 2010. I hardly see how reading a news story is a personal attack. But I'll just read you something else from George Will, who's one of the best respected syndicated columnists of the last 30 years. This is what he said. Said the Obama administration has purchased states' obedience by partially conditioning waivers from onerous federal regulations from the No Child Left Behind law and receipt of federal largesse, $4.35 billion in Race to the Top money from the 2009 stimulus, on the states' embrace of the Common Core. Although 45 states in the District of Columbia have struck this bargain, most with little debate, some are reconsidering, and more will do so as opposition mounts.
I guess if I get to be the final voice for this evening, I would like to express my gratitude to everyone who came out tonight to be active rather than passive, to thank my panelists for their passion and their diligence. I've spoken with you before. I'd like to speak with you again because our most important common concern is the education of our children. And I think that's something everyone can get behind.
Thank you. I wanted to thank everyone else for coming out as well.